When we start to get into American colonial furniture, we're going to start running into a number of problems. After all, they're basically copying ideas from wherever they're from, primarily England in this case, since we're dealing with the Jacobean. Now, the houses tend to be very sparsely furnished at this point. Furniture is very expensive. It's something that requires a skilled craftsman, and they don't have a lot of skilled craftsmen to deal with. When we look at, for example, American versus English Jacobean, you will notice that the American example on the left is a lot simpler than the English example on the right. The reason is they aren't generally sending the best craftsmen from those woodworking shops in England over to the colonies. Instead, what you generally have are people with general skills. I can woodwork. I have done rough carpentry, for example. And those people are suddenly being asked to make chairs and trying to do so in something that more or less resembles the form that they're familiar with from England or that they're finding in pattern books that are being sent over. So the early furniture tends to mimic the styles that we see in Europe, but it tends to be a little bit heavier. It tends to be a little bit clumsier. The methods that they're working with are more or less the same, a lot of mortise and tenon and dowel joinery. But you're going to see, for example, the relief carving will lack some detail, or the seat will be heavier, physically heavier than what you would expect. So we often see some simplification of the style. We're going to see things that are somewhat similar and somewhat different. If you're ever asked to tell the difference between American and English, the easiest way to do it is honestly to look at it in comparison to an English example. Does it look like it fits there, or does it look heavier and more awkward? Something with details that are lacking. For example, a turned leg would tell me that that's more likely an American example than a cabriole leg, because the turn leg is going to be easier to create. Now, a lot of this is due to simplicity, just sort of that frontier simplicity, that pragmatic simplicity that we see throughout the United States or Americas during this time. It's also due to puritanical or Puritan sumptuary laws, which basically state that you can only have those things that are necessary. You can't have things that have additional luxuries added to them. We're going to see a lot of painted furniture. The reason is painted furniture is cheaper and easier to manufacture and deal with than relief carving. And even when we see relief carving, as we do on the left there, we're going to see painted details on it, or in this case, ebonized details that have been added to it, rather than the detailed relief work that we're used to from the European Baroque, Rococo, and Neoclassical. In the South, we will often see cushions with what's called stump work. Now, stump work is embroidery. So in other words, I'm taking a piece of cloth and I'm sewing my form into it, whatever my design is. But stump work is a very raised form of embroidery. There's a lot of texture to it. So it's really raised up above the surface quite a bit, and that usually stands out. Now, this is a framed example, but generally you would see stump work used for cushions or chair backs, something along those lines, usually as upholstery rather than a framed piece. Oftentimes later on, they were cut out and framed to preserve the stump work and get rid of all of the excess in the form of the cushion.